Chapter 3, Accessing the Mirror. The Hermitage was a 3-story building, tall and narrow with a small porch in front of the main entry and a small garage to the left. Around it, the house had a fenced garden. The fence at the back separated it from the much larger Caddick Academy Park. Ulrich, Odd and Richard arrived at the front gate together. The other children were already there, waiting for them seated on a swing that also served as a settee. They had all come, Jeremy, Elida, Eva, and Yumi, holding Kiwi in her arms. Odd saw his dog, though he gave no sign of recognizing him, and the little puppy growled at him, suspicious. But this only lasted an instant. The teen ran towards him, and Kiwi began to bark, overly excited, licking his face like he did with everyone. Kiwi was still injured and his body was covered in bandages. According to Jeremy, 2 large dogs had attacked him. The same ones who always accompanied the man with the red pickup, who had attacked Odd's father and Yumi's parents. Ulrich approached Yumi and put his arm around her shoulders. "It was nice of you to bring him." "Actually," she responded, blushing, "I had to do it. Hiraki went out with our mum today, and Kiwi wouldn't stop complaining." "Well, other than that, you gave Odd a nice surprise." "What do you say?" exclaimed Jeremy, who until now had been talking to Elida some distance away from the group. "We cut the chit-chat and get to work. We have a whole virtual world to explore." During this time, Richard hadn't stopped looking around him for one instant, distracted like a child with sweets in sight but who is afraid of getting in trouble with mother and father. Ulrich almost found this touching. He was 10 years older than them, much taller and with completely uncombed red hair, but he seemed so shy. "Is everything okay?" he asked him. Richard nodded but then shook his head. "I think one of us should stay here, in the garden, to keep watch, in case someone comes." "But who would come here?" Jeremy mocked. "Well, I think it's a good idea," Elida replied, approaching Richard and placing a hand on his shoulder. "The man with dogs could still be hanging around, and I would feel a lot safer knowing someone was out here keeping their eyes peeled." Richard Dupuy's face brightened with an ample smile. Lone Wolf had been right. Hannibal Mago had brought an entire army with him. Walter and his companions remained in their position, watching the long lines of men and vehicles disembark from the plane, soldiers in camouflage uniform with semi-automatic pistols, faces hidden by helmets and gas masks, and 5 trucks, 2 open ones transporting troops and 3 carrying crates and equipment. "This is crazy," said Walter. "How are they going to move around the city with all these weapons and camouflage paint vehicles? It's as if they want to invade France." "He managed to land a military plane at a public airport," breathed Lone Wolf. "Do you realize how much that must have cost him? This guy has enough money to go wherever he wants." "And here's Mago in person," Weasel announced. Walter held the binoculars back up again. At that moment a white, open-roofed Jeep descended from the plane, driven by a woman around 40 years old with striking red hair. At her side was a man of unidentifiable age with his face partially hidden by a wide-brimmed purple hat. He was dressed in a suit and tie, both purple, and on his hands, resting on the dashboard, shone dozens of rings. "He's like a gangster with a fancy tailor," Walter commented. "Did you hear that, boss?" Ferret said after bursting out laughing. "A fancy gangster?" Grigory Nictapolis's pickup approached the Jeep and the man stepped out, closely followed by 2 Rottweilers with pitch-black coats. He and Mago exchanged brief nods. "Get back to the car," hissed Lone Wolf. "They're about to head out." The group moved like a rigid snake around the perimeter of the airport and after several seconds the men in Black's sedan appeared behind them. Walter sat in front with Lone Wolf and nervously fiddled with his seat belt. He carried a gun underneath his jacket. And there was an army moving in front of them. He wasn't suited to this kind of thing. Mago's soldiers had hidden their weapons under a fake bottom in the trucks and they were now looking around, joking with one another, hissing and gesturing at the pretty girls they saw on the roads. Walter had never seen such frightened grimaces in his life. "Where are they going?" he asked. "I haven't the slightest idea," Lone Wolf responded. "The only one who knew anything about any of this was you, and you lost your memory 10 years ago." "Maybe they're heading for the Hermitage," Walter murmured. This name provoked anxiety within him. He remembered the somewhat gloomy chalet. He had been there many times, but when? And why? Mago's Jeep, at the head of the strange fleet of vehicles, drove onto a narrow street between 2 rows of buildings and stopped at the end of it, where there was a high wall made of bricks. On Mago's order, 10 men armed with pickaxes got out of the first truck and began to work away at the wall. "I know this place," Walter cried suddenly. "Kadak Academy is near here, and the Hermitage, and, do you know what's on the other side of this wall?" Walter nodded as his head turned. It was as if he had been this same way a million times during his life. But everything was enveloped in a dense, white cloud, like cream. "There's a road," he stammered. "It has been closed off for a long time. And beyond the road there's a fence. And then a bridge. And a factory on an island right in the middle of the river." Lone Wolf scratched his head, pensive. "A hidden abandoned factory, and Kadak Academy right beside it. It's like a full circle. And I'm sure that we'll find Hopper right in the middle of all this. The school, the factory, and the house form a sort of triangle." Walter burst out, shifting in his seat. "And I get the feeling that there's something important in the Hermitage." The boss of the men in black smiled. "Dido was sure that you could help us. Now, I'll tell you what we're going to do. My men and I will get out here and watch Mago, while you take the car and go to the Hermitage, to secure the perimeter. And that means cutting the electricity and telephone wires and checking that there's no one in the house. If there are intruders, neutralize them. And then, call me. If I don't respond, get in contact with Dido straight away and tell her that we have a problem. Understood?" Walter felt a bead of sweat slide down his forehead and stop, suspended on the tip of his nose. "Understood," he whispered. The Hermitage's semi-basement covered the entire floor space of the house and the garage. Higher up on the walls was a row of windows, low but large, through which little light filtered due to the dust covering the glass. At the end of the main hallway was a closed door that led to the underground passage allowing access to the sewers, and from there, Kadak and the supercomputer factory. Jeremy led the group through piles of more or less damp old junk to the cold room, an ample cement room closed by a thick, large, metallic door. Thanks to a series of open holes in these walls, the room could be refrigerated to store meat, vegetables, and other perishable foods. But this was not the most important thing about this room, and the children had taken a long time to discover what was. "Come on," Jeremy exclaimed. "Let's open the door." Ulrich and Yumi immediately set to work. First, the boy hoisted himself onto a row of hooks for hanging ham on and pulled it down. The girl went to another hook, and pushed it up. Meanwhile, Jeremy opened, and closed the door of the room. The expectant silence that followed was suddenly interrupted by a metallic sound and a grinding noise. After this part of the wall was raised, revealing a small door. "Me first," cried Odd, raising a hand to the sky. Richard Dupuy wrapped his coat tightly around himself and sat beneath a tree. He realized too late that the ground was soft and muddy and the back of his pants became covered in mud. He huffed as he sat comfortably. At least he couldn't get himself any dirtier. "You should have gone inside with the others," he told himself. That much was true, but he hadn't had the courage. The teens didn't understand it. They were too young and energetic for it, but him, all that surpassed him, quite simply. Richard was 23 years old, he went to university and it wasn't long before he would receive his diploma in engineering. His life was peaceful and planned out, with equations to solve and projects to complete. And then, everything had changed. His Palm computer had begun to fill itself with unknown codes and he had needed to return to his old city, to his old school. He had found one of his old best friends, where he had lived 10 years earlier, and he had realized that Elida seemed to be 13 years old. He had discovered the existence of a virtual world into which people could really enter, and where artificial monsters had decided to take over the world. And after that, there were the men with Rottweilers. And the secret government agents. And many more things. A whole crazy story. And now, he had to go into the basement of a ruined house to see his ex-best friend dematerialized into a science fiction supercomputer? No thanks. Now all he had left to do was go mad. Richard took his Palm computer out of his pocket and began to revise the various pages of codes for the umpteenth time. Jeremy said that they were in a programming language invented by Professor Hopper. Richard decided that the boy was right. It was a machine language, and a very complicated one to decode, but the sound of tires made him jump. He leapt to his feet and instinctively hid behind the trunk of a tree. The dark sedan had traversed the roads at full speed to then slow down in front of the Hermitage, leaving 2 dark tracks on the bitumen. A man around 50 years old with very short hair got out. He was dressed in a black suit and tie and black sunglasses and wore a preoccupied expression on his face. Richard saw him approach the gate and muse about something. The young man tried to beat him inside. He ran towards the garage, still staying behind the trees so as not to be seen. He had to raise the alarm, immediately. Jeremy opened the door of the scanner column, allowing everyone to see a narrow, circular space that was completely empty. Odd had disappeared. The boy sat in front of the terminal again. A perfect transfer, he announced. Odd is in the virtual world of the mirror. He heard the rest of the teens pile up behind him to take a look. The computer screen showed Odd's face, although it was very different now. He had symmetrical mauve-colored stripes on his cheeks and forehead, and 2 cat ears sticking out from his hair. He had taken the appearance of the cat boy he always looked like on Lyoko. "Can you hear me?" Jeremy asked him, taking the terminal microphone. Loud and clear, his friend's voice crackled through the speakers. "But, Elida told me that I'd find myself in a sort of plaza with 3 trees, but I don't see anything like that here. I'm on a road in a city." Jeremy nodded. The 3 trees were a simple menu to access the different levels in the mirror, so I bypassed them and sent you directly to your destination. You'll need to explore the area a bit to understand how this level of the journal works. "Got it," Odd smiled. "Send Elida and Yumi, and we'll get to it." Jeremy leaned back from the computer keyboard and ran a hand through his hair. "Yumi, it's your turn. Enter the column. You're number 2. The girl squeezed Ulrich's hand gently in a silent goodbye. "Let's go," she then smiled. "I don't want to leave Odd alone for too long. Who knows what kind of trouble he could get himself into otherwise." After closing the car door with a yank, Walter tried to loosen his tie, tied around his neck, but he hadn't succeeded. His fingers were trembling too much. He was there, in front of the house. To him it seemed like a vision right out of one of his nightmares. And for a moment, he was happy he was armed. Pushing it to the back of his mind, he gently pulled the gate towards him, applying pressure to raise it a little. The old lock protested, and opened with a click, giving him no need to force it open. His brain may have lost memories, but his body knew this place. And he knew how to get around it. The man took large steps towards one side of the house. The rusted iron box on the garage wall immediately drew his attention and he smiled. It was the fuse box. He opened it quickly, took pliers out from his interior pocket and began to cut cables left and right. Elida opened the scanner door, revealing an empty space. "Yumi has also been transferred," Jeremy exclaimed, eyes riveted on his computer screen. "Go on, Elida, you're the last of the team." The girl nodded, hesitated a moment, and eventually entered. The sliding door closed behind her and the bright light coming from the scanner ceiling gushed around her. "Get ready," Jeremy said. His voice came from the speakers inside the column, and seemed distorted and metallic. Elida closed her eyes. She was on the verge of entering the second level of her father's journal. Maybe she would find the answers she was looking for within it. When she accessed a virtual world, the scanner released jets of air that made her levitate, raising her feet from the ground, her hair flying up like arrows and her whole body softly tingling. But none of that was happening now. Elida opened her eyes again. It was dark, but she was still inside the column. "What happened?" she cried, starting to bang against the scanner walls. It smelled burnt, and a dense smoke crept into her lungs, making her cough incessantly. Jeremy rifled anxiously in his pockets, took out his phone and pressed some buttons. The small screen lit up, brightening the room, which had suddenly plunged into total darkness. "Come on," he said. "Use your phones to give us a little light." "What happened?" Ulrich asked. "The power's been cut. The scanner's processors are fried and the column is filling with smoke," Jeremy cried, his anxiety lining his voice. "We need to get Elida out of there now." Ulrich gestured to Eva and the two ran out of the room, using their phones as torches. Several minutes later, they returned with a large shovel. Ulrich slotted the iron part of the shovel in the crack between the scanner doors and began to push against the wooden handle. "It's full of smoke in here," their friend's cry came from within the column. "Help me." The metal door yielded in one blow, and Elida fell out with her hands over her mouth and nose. Jeremy immediately approached her and took her in his arms. "What happened?" the girl asked, confused. "We don't know. There was a blackout and the system short-circuited." Jeremy felt his temples palpitate. He was afraid. If the power had been cut but a moment later, right in the middle of Ilida's transfer into the mirror, she would have disappeared into nothing, lost in a broken digital flux. Ulrich grabbed his friend by the shoulders. His pupils were completely dilated to adapt to the meager light of the phones. Yumi and Odd, he cried in despair. What happened to them? What? Don't worry, they're fine. The mirror is a sort of sandbox inside the factory supercomputer, remember? Jeremy soothed him. They're safe and sound inside the virtual world, he reflected for a moment and adjusted his glasses on his nose before continuing. The only problem is that now, we can't get them out of there. The scanner is out of order. And if something happens to them while they're inside? Ilida asked. And if they encounter a monster? Jeremy didn't respond. It was better to not think about this possibility. At any rate, for the moment, there was nothing they could do. Immediately after, the children jumped. Noises, footsteps in the basement hallway, someone stumbling and falling, grumbling in a low voice. Richard. Jeremy and Ulrich left the secret room and illuminated the young man. He had a terrified expression on his face. Someone came, Richard warned them. A man completely dressed in black. He cut the light cables and did weird things outside. He's coming this way now. Jeremy looked at Ulrich and in his eyes saw the same thought as the one running through his own head. The men in black had found the hermitage. Chapter 4, Fragments of the Past. Yumi looked all around her, somewhat perplexed. The young girl was convinced that she was a genuine expert on virtual worlds. After all, she had experienced many adventures on Lyoko, and not too long ago, she had been to the first city thanks to some strange machines in Brussels. But this place was very bizarre. Or rather, to be more precise, it was normal. It didn't contain the bright colors typically found in a cartoon, and the sky didn't seem to be an unrealistic shade of blue either. The young girl was currently on the street in a more usual city. Her city. Yumi knew this narrow back road surrounding tall buildings very well. It wasn't far from Kadak. Welcome, Odd greeted her. Her friend had the appearance of a cat boy that he usually adopted while on Lyoko. He was dressed in purple overalls, his hands were covered with clawed gloves, and behind him swung a long tail. Yumi had also experienced a transformation. Her hair was held up by small pins, her face was covered in white makeup, and she was dressed in a short kimono. Her feet were covered with traditional Japanese socks, known as tabi, and she was wearing a pair of wooden geta sandals. The obi sash that surrounded her waist hid the tops of her razor-sharp fans. Do you know where we are? Odd asked her, while he jumped from side to side with the agility of a cat. Yumi furrowed her eyebrows. Ulrich had maybe been right, Odd had been acting strange for some time now. How could he not know this street? The girl motioned for him to follow her and walked from the road onto a wide avenue. Few cars drove around and there were even fewer pedestrians. The sky was largely gloomy as if the sun had barely begun to rise. It was dawn. Yumi approached a passerby with groggy eyes reading a recently purchased newspaper. Excuse me, she bit her tongue for a moment. What would this man say if he saw her dressed like a geisha? But he completely ignored her, as if she didn't exist. Unsure of herself, Yumi tried to give him a tap to get his attention, but her fingers passed right through him without managing to touch him. She had become a ghost. He can't see me or hear me, she murmured. Odd squatted down in front of the man to get a glimpse of the front page of his newspaper. Now we know what day it is, 1st of June, 1994. Does that mean anything? Yumi covered her mouth with her hands. Even you should know that, idiot. In 5 days, Hopper will take Ilida to Lyoko to hide there. In other words, it'll be the start of all our adventures. Are you saying that this is a reconstruction of that moment? Looks that way, nodded Yumi. Maybe Hopper wanted to show Ilida something important. By the way, where is she? Why hasn't she arrived yet? The communication with the others is blocked, Odd said, shaking his head. The electricity is down at the hermitage, and Ilida's transfer was interrupted. Yumi examined his face fixedly, taken aback. How could he know these things? Odd seemed to realize that he had said too much. Jeremy told me just after you arrived here, he hurried to add. And our communication was lost. Afterwards. But, the young boy extended a claw, pointing his finger to the other side of the street. See that lady walking softly over there? Don't you think she looks a lot like Professor Hertz? It did appear to be her, without a doubt, even though she seemed younger, with brown hair mixed with a little gray. She was dressed in a shirt and jeans, and had a slim physique. She didn't resemble the calm professor that the children knew. Yumi and Odd crossed the avenue, but the woman continued on her way without noticing their presence. She advanced with a lowered head and a busy look on her face. This nothing but a recording, Yumi observed. The same thing happened to Ilita when she visited the first level of the journal. We can't do or say anything to anyone, only observe what happened 10 years ago. Professor Hertz arrived at a small bar at the corner of the street. The owner was washing the bar, and the smell of recently baked croissants fresh out of the oven began to float through the air. Yumi was shocked. In the virtual world, generally speaking, there was no sense of smell or taste. How had Hopper managed to reconstruct this place in such detail? Another person was also in the bar, a woman with short, blonde hair and a pair of very dark, enormous sunglasses that hid the majority of her face. She was sitting at a table, alone. Major Steinbach greeted the woman as she stood up. Agent Dido, the professor replied with a neutral tone and an unexpressive face. It's been a long time. Hertz didn't seem at all happy about this meeting. She ordered a coffee from the waiter and took the chair on the other side of the table, facing the mystery woman. Odd and Yumi sat on the ground, near the two women, to listen to them. Her name is Steinbach, the young girl murmured. Do you remember what Ilita saw on the first level? Professor Hertz is the same woman that helped Hopper escape Carthage. Yumi couldn't believe her eyes. Professor Hertz was an officer in the army. The waiter brought the coffee, walking through Yumi while doing so. The young girl shuddered. It was all a crazy illusion. She remained hopeful that Jeremy would return soon as possible. She wanted to get out of here. Dido took several sips of her coffee during the dead silence. You've been pretty busy these last few years, she said while leaning forward, her eyes riveted to Hertz's. What are you trying to say? I know that you and Hopper live here and that you have continued to work on Project Carthage. I know that you have rebuilt the first city. And not just that, I also know how you enter it. I have access codes, and by using old projects, we rebuilt the necessary equipment in Brussels to connect us to it. When running away, you left behind a series of notes. Hertz trembled. She knocked over her cup on the table and the dark liquid dripped onto the floor. Yumi jumped to her feet to avoid the mess, but the drops went through her without leaving a trace. So it was this woman, Dido, who had created the scanners in the apartment in Brussels. It wasn't the work of Hopper, but of Dido and her men in black. In any case, the professor retorted. The notes won't help you. Adults cannot use the scanners. Dido nodded and ignored the subject as if it didn't interest her. I asked to see you, she murmured. To make something clear, I don't want to declare war against neither you nor Hopper. Seriously, the woman replied after having studied her with uncertainty for several moments. Things have changed, said Dido. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Cold War has ended. Project Carthage cost us an arm and a leg, and it has only created millions of problems. I think those on top are starting to fear it. The first city demonstrated itself to be completely uncontrollable, and if it is made operational, it could turn against us. In fact, the whole project is much too risky. Then, when you escaped from our base, Hopper destroyed the prototype of the first city. After that, I erased the memories of those who had collaborated with you. You mean those who transformed Project Carthage into a weapon? Nothing remains of those memories anymore, replied Dido, making a vague gesture with her hand as if the subject was of no importance. And I want the world to completely forget the existence of Carthage and the first city. What do you mean, Dido? Said Hertz, standing. Speak with Hopper. Tell me where the supercomputer that you have constructed is located and let me destroy it. I will erase your minds of certain confidential information, only the most dangerous details, and then leave you to live in peace. You too as well as Ilita. I'm offering you salvation. Out of the question. Hertz burst out. Be smart about this, Dido insisted. You know to what extent I can be dangerous. Something fell on Yumi's head. The young girl turned towards Odd, her yes shooting daggers. Really? You think this is a good time to be throwing things at me? I didn't do anything, the boy protested. Yumi looked at her feet where the object that just hit her had landed. It was a small, sky blue box made of plastic that somewhat resembled a control box. Under a small screen were 3 red buttons. 2 of them were in the shape of two-way arrows, one turned towards the right and the other towards the left, like the buttons for rewinding and fast-forwarding a DVD. The third came with a small label, Free Exploration. Yumi suddenly sensed that the coffee dripping onto the floor had soaked the material of her kimono. Embarrassed, she stood up and passed the box to Odd to try to squeeze it out, but the stain quickly began to dry up and disappeared in several seconds. "Hey!" cried Yumi, surprised. Odd didn't even turn to look at her. He seemed absorbed in his thoughts. He finally spoke. "This remote control is a navigation interface." Hopper programmed his diary so that he could highlight the events that were most important. We can move through them however we want through the city and across the days that are saved. This is the free exploration. Or we can jump directly to the interesting things, or go back if we missed something. The young girl couldn't believe her ears. Her friend had never understood a word of technology before. Why did he seem so sure of himself now, like Mr. Know-It-All? These two are continuing to talk, but they aren't saying anything important. I propose that we move forward to see what else happened. Before Yumi had the time to protest, Odd pressed the button and the world started to dissolve around them. Dido and Professor Hertz started to become transparent, then completely disappeared. The walls and the roof, however, became darker and finally rained on them like a waterfall of colors. Yumi started to feel vertigo, and she focused on Odd, his purple clothes and cat tail, the only elements that were still solid and real. "Odd," she murmured, falling to her feet. "It'll only last a moment," said Odd, taking her by the hand. "It's only a system update." "Huh? Since when did you start talking like Jeremy?" The images then recovered their clarity, and Yumi saw that everything had changed around the kids. They found themselves in the old factory on the island. To be more precise, they were on the 3rd underground floor, the lowest level, and the most secret. The room was large and shone with a pale blue light. Almost the entire available space was occupied by a tall, dark, metal cylinder with a surface covered in strange, golden hieroglyphs. This was the supercomputer that Lyoko's existence depended on. Yumi was so used to seeing it shut down and in the dark that she now felt a quivering of emotions that was spreading through her whole body in spurts. She turned towards Odd with a smile and saw that the child had eyes round like saucers and was trembling like jelly. "Are you okay?" she asked him. "Look," he replied. "Hopper." Hidden behind the metal of the computer, Elita's father was crouched down, working with a big screwdriver and a laptop at his side, placed on the ground. He was wearing a lab coat and had a long beard and a pair of round glasses. His face was very serious and seemed emaciated from lack of sleep. A noise could be heard, and Hopper raised his head. Someone else had just entered the room through the lift that connected the underground levels with the main floor of the factory. It was Professor Hertz, dressed in the same way she was during her meeting with Dido. Yumi looked at the control box that Odd was clenching in his hands. On the screen appeared the text 1 June 1994, 4:30 p.m. They were on the same day and had only moved forward a few hours. XANA was shaking inside of Odd's body. He had worked so hard, acted in the shadows, hiding himself. And he was now only a step away from his triumph. He was finally before the supercomputer, the bridge to Lyoko. This was a different Lyoko, the Lyoko of 1994, but maybe only from there would it even be possible to surpass the barriers of the sandbox and access the real virtual world in which he could recover his strength. The portion of XANA inhabiting the body of Eva Skinner advised him to wait a bit and remain very attentive. Yumi had been on the verge of discovering him when he had been carried away by his emotions and when he figured out the box to navigate the mirror too quickly. He needed to take into account that Odd had only a pea brain. But he was almost there. Lyoko. And if his calculations were correct, Hannibal Mago was about to arrive at the real factory, at the real supercomputer. XANA immediately realized that Caddick was under the surveillance of very sophisticated spy microcameras, and he had carried out some research. His capacities on the internet were almost unlimited, and he hadn't been slow to investigate, to the very last detail, Mago and the Green Phoenix. Clearly, XANA had preferred not to say a word to the children, given that in the future, the Green Phoenix could become a strong ally. This stupid kid, Yumi, had seized him by the arm, forcing him to focus on Hopper and Hertz. The professor listened to several sentences and then straightened up, shaking the screwdriver in the air as if it were a weapon. "It's not possible," he cried. "There was no way for Dido to know that we reconstructed the first city. We kept the secret absolutely hidden. It was our last hope to transform the project into a weapon for peace. We should think carefully about our next step," said Hertz while she brushed past his shoulder. "Dido let slip a very important clue. She said that she erased the memories of her men. Doesn't that tell you anything?" "Our memory snatching machine," whispered Hopper. "Someone sold the plans to our machine." "Yes," Hertz confirmed. "We built it to fill the virtual world with real-world information. But if we used it with the polarity reversed, its effect would be precisely that of erasing people's memories. It can't be a simple coincidence that Dido possesses a similar device. There was only one person among us who knew of the existence of the sandbox, the first city and the memory-snatching machine, and that person is Walter." Walter's turn. Yumi leapt up, placing her hands over her mouth, horrified. "Ulrich's father," she cried. "But that's not possible. It must be a mistake. I don't believe it. It's impossible." Odd also had jumped to his feet. "Look, Hopper's completely flipping out." Hopper began pacing around the supercomputer room in big steps, his face obscured by a grave and sinister expression. "Then there's only one thing that I can do," he declared at last. "Prepare an escape plan." "What are you talking about?" Hertz demanded, regarding him intensely. "Elida and I should leave here. I will take code down and divide it into several parts to prevent anyone from reconstructing it. And then, I will escape with my daughter." "Code down," whispered Yumi. "What's that?" XANA hadn't the slightest idea. He continued to listen to Hertz very attentively. "You can't do that. All that we've accomplished up until now, the creation of Lyoko and code down, it'll all be completely lost. I will leave several tracks. I will hide information that only Elida and I will be able to follow." "Why Elida?" asked Hertz all while shaking her head. "She's still so young." "Think about it," smiled Hopper. "The men in black want to find me, and I don't know how much time we still have. They could capture me, but I'm sure that I'll be able to save Elida one way or another. So, when she is older, she can learn what happened. I plan to create a virtual diary. I will use my memories, yours, whatever information I could need to trace out a map that Elida will be capable of interpreting." Hertz nodded her head. "And me?" she asked. "What should I do?" "Call the friends working with us and have a meeting with them," Hopper said after thinking for an instant. "Invent whatever kind of excuse. For example, that Walter wants us to fire us all. When everyone's together, use the memory-snatching machine on them. They will forget everything, Lyoko, the factory, the computer. They will be safe. Once this is done, you and I will speak face-to-face with Walter, and finally, I will run far away from here." "And what will we do with Lyoko?" Hertz asked him. "I will shut it down. I have no other option. XANA is becoming more and more dangerous. The virus that got into the first city could make him suddenly become crazy. It's a bug, a programming error, and it's possible that XANA wasn't affected, but all the human training that we submitted him to over the months could also slip away. And well, I don't know what could happen." XANA remained there, listening to the conversation, mouth open, hidden inside the virtual version of Odd. Virus? Programming error? Training? What was Hopper talking about? Next, without warning, an image dating from numerous years ago reappeared in his mind. In general, he held these memories far off in his mind, hidden away in a sure, but distant corner of his digital memory. But all at once, he saw the image of Elida before his eyes, although not the child that he had known in reality, the friend of Eva Skinner, but the Elida that he had met a long time ago, the one who played with him in the deserted city. XANA had a very different character then, and he played with Elida in the parks, transforming himself into a multitude of amusing animals, and he would wait for her at the doors of the Great Wall. Every afternoon. Up until the day when Elida no longer came to play with him. That was why on this day, many years ago, his friend didn't come to meet him like always. Hopper had prevented it. XANA exploded with rage. Yumi felt a violent hit that threw her to the side. In front of her, Hopper and Hertz continued to pronounce the same sentences that they had said 10 years earlier. But the young girl was in no condition to listen anymore. She rolled over. Her friend, Odd, fell to his knees, and he grasped his throat with both hands. He seemed to be suffocating. From his mouth came a black smoke so dense that it blasted Yumi, throwing her to the ground. "XANA," she murmured, shocked. The young girl knew this smoke too well. It was the same that she had seen come out from the mouth of William Dunbar, one of her school friends, when XANA had taken control of his body. Odd collapsed. The cloud of smoke started to condense into a breathtaking whirlwind that took form bit by bit until it became solid. The young girl leapt to her feet. The box fell to the ground. She had to recover it in advance to the next part of the recording, far away from here. She needed to escape. But don't even think about moving, a human voice spoke, freezing her in place. The smoke had disappeared, and in its place a boy had appeared. He was exactly like William Dunbar, with dark hair that was slightly long, a straight nose, and a self-confident expression. He was a little taller than Yumi, and had an athletic physique. Who are you? You already said my name before. You know me. I am XANA, and I am back.
Thank the lover Peggy for that image of XANA at the end there. It was needed to solidify what XANA's corporeal body looked like. So finally, some virtual action and some more deep hidden lore behind Lyoko. I know I'm excited to learn what's next. It'd be real fun to edit without the fear of animatica continually crashing and whatnot. So, if you can't tell from the start of the video, I decided to use the new logo animation for future project videos onward. And I'm sorry for not getting to this sooner because I had a lot going on. Stay tuned for the next episode, whenever that may be coming out. So subscribe, and I'll see you all later.